Thomas Bettson was a monk at Sion Abbey in the late 15th century. He was not a famous man. He would not lead a religious movement or advise a king. He was a librarian, a brother in an order that valued quiet contemplation and the careful keeping of books. Around the year 1500, he kept a personal notebook. It was a mix of things: medical recipes, theological notes, bits of local gossip. A messy human document. On one of the pages, he wrote down a charm, a word puzzle to ward off a fever. Wrote the word abracadabra in a triangle, removing one letter from the end on each new line until only the letter A remained. This wasn't a solemn high magic ritual. It was more like folk medicine, a bit of common superstition. The way he jotted it down feels casual. It feels like something people just knew, a word you use when someone had the chills. It was a piece of verbal shorthand, a slang term for a very specific kind of magical hope. Centuries later, stage magicians would pull it out of a hat and make it famous, a theatrical flourish. But for Brother Thomas Bettson, in his quiet library near London, as the Middle Ages were breathing their last, it was just a useful word. A bit of slang with power. It shows how words that feel new, that feel like they belong to a specific time, often have roots that go down much deeper than we think. They pop up in unexpected places, like a monk's private notebook, showing us that people have always played with language. They have always needed a quick word for a big idea, whether that idea is make this fever go away or something else entirely. Number 10, to throw shade is a courtly art. Isabella of France was born around 1295. She was the daughter of a king and would become the wife of another. Her life was meant to be one of quiet influence, of producing heirs and managing a royal household, but Isabella was not a quiet person, and the court she married into, the English court of her husband, King Edward II, was a complicated, dangerous place. Edward had favorites. His intense and public affection for men like Piers Gaveston was not just a personal matter. It was a political crisis. Gaveston was arrogant. He was given titles and lands that powerful English barons felt belonged to them. They saw him as an upstart, a poison in the king's ear. Isabella, the queen, was sidelined. She was respected as the daughter of the French king, but in her own court she was often ignored. And Edward doted on Gaveston. He showered him with jewels and honors. Some of these were jewels that had been part of Isabella's own dowry. This was not just poor etiquette, it was a public statement. It was a message to the entire court about who held the king's true affection. Isabella could not simply shout at her husband. She could not challenge Gaveston to a duel. A queen, especially a young one in a foreign land, did not have that kind of power. Her power was subtle. It lived in gestures, in careful words, in the art of the public insult that could be denied later. She had to throw shade. The word shade, in its modern sense, a subtle and often non-verbal insult, would have been perfectly understood in the 14th century court. They didn't use that exact word. They might have called it scorn or derision, but the act itself was a vital social skill. In 1312, the conflict around Gaveston reached its peak. The barons were in open revolt. Isabella's position was delicate. One chronicle, the Vita Edwardi Secundi, tells a story about this period. At a great feast, it was customary for the king and queen to circulate to speak with their powerful nobles. Isabella was known for her grace and charm. But when she approached the Earl of Lancaster, a man who despised Gaveston, she was seen to speak with him for a long time. Her expression was serious. They were not laughing. To an outside observer, it was just a queen speaking to a powerful cousin. But everyone in that room knew what they were talking about. They were talking about Gaveston. They were talking about the king. Isabella's public, serious conversation with her husband's greatest enemy was a masterclass in shade. She didn't have to say a word against Edward. She just had to be seen. Her presence at Lancaster's side was a statement. It said, "The king's favorite has insulted me, and I am aligning myself with those who feel the same." It was a political maneuver accomplished with a look and a lowered voice. Later, when Gaveston was captured and executed by the barons, Isabella's role was officially neutral. She was the grieving wife's consort, but no one forgot those public moments of coldness. They remembered the time she turned her back when Gaveston entered her room. They remembered the way she would praise French customs in a way that highlighted the perceived coarseness of Edward's favorite. Another form of this was the language of gifts. In the medieval court, gifts were a language. A king gave a gift of a fine horse to a baron to show favor. The baron gave a gift of a hunting hawk to the king to show loyalty. The value and type of gift were minutely calculated. When Isabella's French relatives sent her luxurious fabrics and jewelry, she would wear them. But she was also known to give gifts to religious houses, very public displays of piety. When she gave an expensive altar cloth to a convent, it was a good and queenly thing to do. But when it was done the day after the king had given Gaveston a new estate, the context changed. Her gift of piety became a subtle rebuke of his gift of indulgence. She was spending her money on God. The king was spending his on a favorite. The shade was thick. This was a world without mass media. There were no newspapers to print anonymous criticisms. Your reputation was built on gossip, on rumor, and on these public displays. The chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker, writing a few decades later, described Isabella as a cunning and intelligent woman who knew how to manipulate the court. He tells of how she carefully cultivated relationships with the men Edward had alienated. She used her charm, her status, and her intelligence to build a network of allies. Every polite inquiry she made about a baron's family, every compliment she paid to his wife, was a small act of alliance against the king and his circle. She was creating an alternative court, a shadow court built on shared resentment. It was all deniable. She was just being a good queen, a friendly and pious woman, but the intent, the shade, was clear to everyone who mattered. Years later, in 1326, Isabella would return to England with an army and her lover Roger Mortimer. She would depose her husband. This final overt act of treason was built on a foundation of years of quiet, careful shade. She had spent a decade and a half undermining her husband not with weapons, but with looks, gestures, and perfectly timed insults that were never quite insults. Number 9, they were salty about the salt tax. The year is 1341. We are in France in the early years of what will become the 100 Years' War. King Philip VI is in desperate need of money. Wars are expensive, soldiers need pay, armor needs to be forged, horses need to be fed. The traditional feudal levies are not enough for this new kind of sustained, large-scale conflict. Philip needs a new, reliable source of income. His advisors come up with a plan. They will reintroduce and enforce a tax on salt. It was called the gabelle. Salt was not a luxury, it was a necessity of life. It was the only way to preserve meat through the winter. It was used to cure leather, to feed livestock, to make cheese. Every single person, from the richest duke to the poorest peasant, needed salt. Taxing it was like taxing the air. And people were furious. They were salty, in both the literal and figurative sense. The modern slang term salty, meaning bitter, angry, or resentful, fits the mood in 14th century France perfectly. The gabelle was not just a tax. It was a constant, irritating reminder of the king's power over the most basic elements of their lives. It was an insult. The tax was brutally enforced. Royal officials known as grenadiers were stationed in salt warehouses. People were forced to buy a certain amount of salt at a fixed, inflated price. You could not just go to the coast and gather your own. You could not buy from a cheaper black market seller. If you were caught smuggling salt, the punishments were severe. Fines, imprisonment, even death. Let's imagine a man named Pierre, a farmer living in a small village in Normandy. Around 1343, his life becomes much harder because of the gabelle. Every few months, he must go to the designated royal warehouse. He has to buy the king's salt. He sees the grenadier, a man who produces nothing, who farms nothing, sitting there with his ledger, taking Pierre's hard-earned coins for a product that used to be cheap and plentiful. The salt itself is a source of resentment, but the true saltiness comes from the injustice of it all. Pierre hears stories. He hears that the nobles are often exempt from the gabelle. He hears that the king is using the money to fund a war that seems far away, a war that only brings more hardship and more taxes. The resentment simmered in every village and town. People complained in taverns. They muttered curses against the tax collectors. The word they used was amer, which means bitter. It's the root of the English word embittered. When they spoke of the gabelle, they spoke with bitterness in their hearts. And the feeling was a constant low-grade anger. It was the saltiness of being cheated. This feeling was so widespread that it even crossed battle lines. The English knew how much the French people hated the gabelle. They used it as a propaganda tool. King Edward III of England, who had his own claim to the French throne, made a point of not enforcing a salt tax in the French lands he controlled. It was a brilliant move. He was essentially saying, live under my rule, and you will not have to suffer this injustice. The saltiness had a voice, and it was often a sarcastic one. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but widely told at the time, that captures the mood. King Edward III of England referred to Philip VI's new tax regime as the Salic law, a pun on the ancient Frankish law that barred women from the throne. The joke was that Philip had invented a new salt law. When Philip heard this, he was said to have retorted that Edward was a wool merchant, a dig at the source of England's wealth. This exchange of insults between kings shows how central the issue was. The gabelle wasn't just a policy, it was a symbol of Philip's rule. To be salty about the gabelle was to be salty about the king himself. The records of the time are full of the consequences of this saltiness. Court documents from across France show countless cases of faussonage, or salt smuggling. People would risk everything to avoid the tax. Fishermen would secretly bring in untaxed salt from the sea. Merchants would create hidden compartments in their carts. In some regions, like Brittany, which had its own salt flats and a history of independence, resistance was organized and violent. Tax collectors were ambushed and killed. Warehouses were burned. This wasn't just criminal activity. It was a form of rebellion fueled by years of resentment. The farmers and merchants involved felt they were taking back what was rightfully theirs. And they were acting on their collective saltiness. The gabelle would remain a source of bitterness in France for centuries. It was one of the most hated taxes in French history, a major grievance that would eventually be cited during the French Revolution in 1789. The anger it created in 1341 never really went away, it just festered. It was a deep, institutionalized saltiness that shaped the relationship between the French people and their rulers for over 400 years. Number 8, a cringeworthy sermon from the 15th century. The word cringe feels intensely modern. It's a reaction to secondhand embarrassment, that full-body clench you feel when you watch someone else make a fool of themselves. But the feeling itself is not new. People have always been capable of spectacular public failure, and other people have always been there to watch and squirm. We can find a perfect example of this in the world of medieval preaching. A sermon was a major public event. It was theater, news, and spiritual guidance all rolled into one. A good preacher could hold a crowd for hours. A bad one could create an atmosphere of pure, unadulterated cringe. Meet Robert Ripon. He was a monk at Durham Abbey in the early 15th century. He was also a prolific writer of sermons. Hundreds of his sermons survive, which is a rare and valuable thing. They give us a window into what a preacher was thinking, how he tried to connect with his audience, and in one of his sermon collections, written around 1401, Ripon gives advice to other less experienced preachers. He tells them what not to do, and in doing so, he paints a vivid picture of a cringeworthy sermon. Ripon warns against preachers who try too hard to be clever. He describes priests who get up in the pulpit and try to show off their Latin using obscure words and convoluted grammar that nobody in the congregation can understand. You can almost feel the secondhand embarrassment. Imagine a small parish church. A young, insecure priest wants to impress the local gentry. He stuffs his sermon with fancy theological terms. He barely understands himself. He quotes from Latin fathers of the church, but he gets the pronunciation wrong. The congregation shuffles their feet. They stare at the ceiling. They exchange glances. They are not impressed. And they are cringing. They feel embarrassed for him. Ripon also goes after preachers who use terrible, inappropriate analogies. He warns against foolish and apocryphal stories that are meant to be entertaining but just end up being bizarre or offensive. He tells of preachers who compare the Virgin Mary to a wine barrel or Christ's body to a piece of cheese. The intention might be to make a theological point more relatable, to bring it down to earth, but the result is just awkward. It's a failed attempt at being down with the kids, medieval style. You can picture the scene. The preacher, proud of his clever cheese analogy, looks out at his flock, expecting looks of dawning comprehension. Instead, he sees confusion, maybe a few suppressed snickers. The moment hangs in the air, heavy with cringe. But Ripon's best example is the preacher who tries to be an actor and fails. He describes priests who use inordinate and foolish gestures. They wave their arms wildly. They adopt strange voices for different characters in a Bible story. They might even try to weep crocodile tears to elicit sympathy from the crowd. Ripon is deeply scornful of this. He sees it as insincere and, worse, embarrassing. The cringe comes from the gap between the preacher's intent and the audience's reception, and he wants to be seen as a vessel of divine passion. The congregation just sees a man making a fool of himself. There's a specific type of failure. Ripon points to the preacher who gets his timing wrong. He tells a long, boring story and then delivers the punchline, the moral of the story, with a great flourish. But nobody cares. The moment has passed. The audience is daydreaming about their lunch. That silence after a failed joke, that's a universal form of cringe. And Ripon's advice is a what not to wear for preachers. It's a guide to avoiding public embarrassment. His writing is full of the kind of exasperation you feel when you see someone trying to be something they're not. The feeling Ripon is describing is exactly what we call cringe. It's not just disapproval, it's a more complex emotion. It's a mix of pity, embarrassment, and a deep instinctual need to look away. Ripon and his fellow monks, listening to a visiting preacher try and fail to be charismatic, would have felt it. The peasant in the back of the church, watching the priest trip over his own Latin, would have felt it. The feeling is timeless, because the source of the feeling is timeless. The public performance of unwarranted self-confidence. Brother Robert Ripon, in his quiet scriptorium in Durham, was not just writing a manual for preachers. He was documenting one of humanity's most uncomfortable and enduring social emotions. Number 7, spilling the tea in the Paston letters. The Paston family lived in Norfolk, England, during the 15th century. They were gentry, not high nobility, but they were ambitious. They were lawyers and landowners, always looking to improve their social standing, and they wrote letters. Thousands of their letters survived, a historical miracle. They are the first great collection of private correspondence in the English language. And they are absolutely full of gossip. The Pastons were masters of spilling the tea. The term tea as slang for gossip is recent, but the act of sharing scandalous or private information is as old as language. For the Pastons, gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was a vital tool for survival and social climbing. Their letters are a network of information, a 15th century private internet, where news about marriages, deaths, lawsuits, and political favors traveled back and forth between Norfolk and London. Let's look at one specific instance. It's 1469. The family is in the middle of a massive, violent dispute over the ownership of Caister Castle. Sir John Paston is in London trying to get political and legal help. His mother, Margaret, and his younger brother, John III, are back in Norfolk, holding the fort. Their letters are a constant stream of urgent news, but they are also filled with a running commentary on the people around them. They are constantly spilling the tea on their enemies, their allies, and even each other. In one letter from that year, a family associate named James Gresham writes to Sir John Paston. He's reporting on the movements of their great rival, the Duke of Norfolk, who is besieging Caister. But he also drops in a juicy bit of London gossip. He mentions that the Lord Treasurer has been dismissed. And then he adds the tea, and some men say he has been spoken to for a less than honorable matter. Because Gresham doesn't say what the matter is. He doesn't have to. The vagueness is part of the gossip. It invites speculation. It's the 15th century equivalent of, I'm not saying what happened, but you won't believe it. Margaret Paston was the queen of this. Her letters to her sons are masterpieces of maternal concern mixed with sharp-eyed social intelligence. She reports on which neighbors are supporting them and which are siding with the Duke of Norfolk. She passes on rumors she heard at the market. In a letter to John III, she might write something like, "Your cousin Elizabeth is to be married to Robert Poynings. They say he is a wild young man and his mother is against the match." This isn't just idle chatter. It's crucial information. Knowing that Poynings is wild or that there is family conflict could be useful in future dealings. The most personal tea is often about marriage negotiations. The Pastons were obsessed with finding good matches for their children. In the 1470s, the family was trying to marry off their daughter Marjorie. One suitor was a man named Richard Cow, the family's bailiff. He was a good and loyal servant, but he was not gentry. A marriage between them would be a social disaster for an ambitious family like the Pastons. Marjorie, however, was, in love with him. The letters about this affair are tense and dramatic. John Paston III writes to his older brother Sir John about the shameful business. He writes that their mother has had a massive argument with Marjorie, and that Marjorie has confessed she is secretly engaged to Cal. He spills all the details. He tells his brother what Marjorie said, what their mother said, how everyone is furious. He writes, "My mother is taking it very heavily. This is pure family tea." He is sharing the intimate, emotional details of a family crisis with his brother, who is miles away. He's not just relaying facts, he's sharing the drama. The language they used for gossip was often couched in terms like tidings or it is said. They would write, "Here are the tidings from Norwich," and then launch into a detailed account of a local scandal. They were careful. They knew that letters could be intercepted, but the urge to share the latest news, the latest bit of tea, was too strong. It was how they stayed connected. It was how they understood their world. When Sir John Fastolf, their patron, died in 1459, a flurry of letters went back and forth discussing his will, who was trying to cheat the family out of their inheritance, and who was behaving dishonorably. They analyzed the character of every executor, every rival claimant. It was a legal battle, but it was understood and conducted through the medium of personal gossip. The Paston letters show that spilling the tea is not a modern invention. It's a fundamental human activity. It's how we process social information, build alliances, and navigate the complicated business of being alive. For the Pastons, it was also a matter of life and death. Number 6, flexing in a fur-trimmed gown. The word flex is modern slang for showing off, especially showing off wealth or status. It's about making a deliberate, conspicuous display. If you want to see the medieval version of a flex, you don't need to look any further than Richard Icke Whittington. He died in 1423, but his story is a classic rags to riches tale. He was a real person, a phenomenally successful merchant who became the Lord Mayor of London 4 times. The story about him and his cat is a later legend. The reality of his life was less about magical cats and more about the calculated and relentless flexing of his immense wealth. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, London was a city of hierarchies. You knew your place. And one of the primary ways you showed your place was through your clothes. Actually, there were even laws called sumptuary laws that dictated what people of different classes could wear. Only nobles were supposed to wear certain types of fur or the color purple. These laws were frequently ignored by men like Whittington. Wearing clothes that were technically above your station was a classic flex. It was a way of saying, I may have been born a commoner, but I have more money than a dozen knights. My wealth is my status. Imagine Whittington walking through the crowded streets of London around 1419, the year of his last mayoralty. He would be wearing a gown of the finest scarlet wool, a color that was incredibly expensive to dye. The gown would be trimmed with marten fur, a luxury reserved for the very wealthy. He might have a heavy gold chain around his neck. His shoes would be of soft, dyed leather. Every element of his outfit was a calculated message. The wool came from the sheep farms he owned. The dye was paid for with profits from his international trade. The fur was a sign that he was as rich as any lord. It was a walking, talking balance sheet. But Whittington's flexing went far beyond his personal wardrobe. His greatest flexes were acts of public philanthropy that were also brilliant exercises in personal branding. He wasn't just donating to charity, he was stamping his name on the city of London itself. For example, he funded the rebuilding of the library at Greyfriars. About a generous act, certainly. But he also made sure that every book in that library was chained to the desk with a chain that bore his coat of arms. Anyone who used the library would be constantly reminded of who paid for it. His most famous project was the public toilet he funded in 1421. It was called Whittington's Longhouse. It had 128 seats, 64 for men and 64 for women, and it was flushed by the tide of the River Thames. This was an incredible piece of public infrastructure, a massive improvement in public sanitation, but it was also a monumental flex. In a city where most people used a bucket or a hole in the ground, a huge, clean public latrine named after you was the ultimate power move. It was a statement of wealth so vast that you could literally afford to build a palace for human waste. He also contributed a huge sum of money to the rebuilding of his local parish church, St. Michael Paternoster Royal. After he died, he was buried there in a grand tomb, but he also had the windows of the church replaced with new stained glass. And in those windows, alongside images of saints and apostles, he had images of himself and his coat of arms installed. And every time the sun shone through those windows, it projected the image of Dick Whittington's personal brand onto the floor of the church. And worshippers praying to God were doing so under the gaze of their benefactor. This was not seen as arrogant or tacky at the time. It was expected. Great men were supposed to be patrons. Their wealth was supposed to benefit the public. But there was always a transaction. The public got a library or a toilet. The patron got status and a form of immortality. Every time someone said, "I'm going to Whittington's Longhouse," they were reinforcing his legacy. The medieval flex was about permanence. A new doublet would eventually wear out. A building with your name on it could last for centuries. Richard Whittington used his money to transform the physical and social fabric of London. And in doing so, he made sure that no one would ever forget who he was or what he had. It was the ultimate city-spanning flex. Number 5, when a bee was spelled lemon. Today, people use the word bae as a term of endearment for a romantic partner. It's short, it's intimate, it's a bit of modern slang. The Middle Ages had its own version, a word that was just as intimate, just as common, but carried a much more complicated and often scandalous weight. That word was leman. On the surface, leman meant sweetheart or beloved. It comes from the Old English leman, literally dear person. You can see the root of the modern word love right there. In poetry and songs, a knight might call his lady his leman. A woman might refer to her beloved as her leman. It could be a perfectly innocent, tender word, but it had a double meaning. And that second meaning is where things get interesting, because layman was also the most common word for a mistress or an illicit lover. It lived in a gray area. It could mean my beloved, but it could also mean my secret lover, the one I'm not married to. And that ambiguity was part of its power. Okay, let's look at the life of Alice Perrers. She lived in the 14th century and became the mistress of the powerful King Edward III in his old age. She was not a noblewoman. She was clever, beautiful, and ambitious. And to many people at court, she was the king's leman. The chroniclers of the time, men like Thomas Walsingham, were vicious in their descriptions of her. They called her the king's concubine and his lemon. They accused her of manipulating the old, senile king for her own gain. They claimed she sat by his side in court, interfering with legal cases, and flaunted the jewels the king gave her. When they called her the king's leman, it was a deliberate insult. It was a way of highlighting the illicit nature of their relationship. The king had a wife, Queen Philippa. Alice was the other woman. The word lemon, in this context, was dripping with moral disapproval. It was a way of saying she was sexually powerful, but socially illegitimate. And yet, from the king's perspective, Alice might very well have been his loveman, his dear person, his beloved. In the privacy of the royal chambers, he might have called her his leman with genuine affection. The same word could be a tender endearment or a public condemnation, depending entirely on who was speaking. We also see the word in the legal records of the time. Church courts were constantly dealing with cases of adultery and fornication. In the records of the Diocese of London from the 1490s, you can find cases where a man is accused of living in sin with a woman. The court documents might state that he keeps a leman in his house. Here, the word has no romance at all. It's a technical term for an illegal sexual partner. It's evidence in a case. A woman accused of being a leman could face public shaming and punishment. But the word's romantic, poetic sense never fully disappeared. It was used in the popular romance poems of the day. In a story like Sir Orfeo, a king loses his queen to the fairy world. He wanders the wilderness for 10 years, grieving, and he thinks of her as his lost lemon. In this context, the word is full of pathos and tragedy. It speaks of a deep and true love. Geoffrey Chaucer, the great poet of the 14th century, used the word in both its senses. In The Miller's Tale, the saucy character Absalom tries to woo the carpenter's wife, Alison. He sings a song outside her window, calling her his dearest leman. Here, it's part of a clumsy, comical seduction, but in other tales, the word has a more sincere ring. The word leman eventually fell out of use. By the time of Shakespeare, it already sounded old-fashioned. The words like mistress or sweetheart took over its different meanings. But for a few hundred years, le man was the go-to word for a beloved. It was a word that could be whispered in a bedchamber or shouted as an accusation in a courtroom. It held all the complexity of love, desire, and social judgment in its two short syllables. It was the medieval bay, but with a whole lot more baggage. Number 4, the original dude was a scarecrow. The word dude is one of the most flexible words in modern American English. It can be a greeting, an exclamation, a term for a friend, or just a generic word for a person. Its origins are usually traced back to the late 19th century, referring to a fancy, dandified city dweller. But the sound, the feeling of the word, has a much older and stranger echo in the English language. That echo is the Middle English word dud. A dud was a cloak or a mantle, a heavy piece of outerwear. It wasn't a fancy garment. It was a practical, often coarse piece of clothing. By the 1500s, the plural form, duds, had come to mean clothes in general, especially old or shabby clothes. We still use it that way today when we talk about duds or getting dudded up. But the story doesn't stop there. Let's go to a field in rural England, somewhere around the year 1440. A farmer named John is setting up a figure to scare the crows away from his new sown barley. He takes a couple sticks, ties them together in the shape of a man, and then drapes them with old, torn clothes. He might put a ragged, old hat on top. This figure, this man made of sticks and old clothes, was sometimes called a dudman or a dudman. It was literally a man of rags. The dudeman was a familiar sight in the medieval and early modern countryside. It was a non-person, an empty imitation of a human being. It had the shape of a man, but it was just duds. It was a thing, not a person. The word captured a sense of emptiness, of something that was all surface and no substance. This is a long way from the friendly, casual dude of today. But the connection is in that idea of a generic, slightly featureless figure. The evolution of the word is murky, but we can see a thread. The dudeman was a man of rags. The dudes were the rags themselves. Over time, the word seems to have carried a slightly derogatory sense. A person who was all clothes and no substance, someone who was perhaps not very bright, could be called a dude. There are hints of this in regional dialects. The word retained its association with shabbiness and emptiness. When the word dude appears in the 1880s in America, it's used to describe a very specific type of person. He was a man who was overly concerned with his clothes, a fop, a dandy. He was the opposite of the rugged, authentic cowboy. He was all style, all surface. Think of the dudeman scarecrow, the figure that is nothing but clothes. The 19th century dude was also, in a way, a man of clothes. His identity was defined by his fashionable duds. The word was an insult. It implied that under the fancy suit there was nothing of substance. The famous dude ranches of the American West got their name from this. They were ranches for dudes, for city folk who wanted to play at being cowboys. The real cowboys looked at these tourists in their brand new boots and clean hats and saw them as inauthentic. They were just playing a role. They were dudes. How did a word for an overdressed fool transform into a friendly, all-purpose term of address? It happened in the 20th century through subcultures. Surfer culture in California in the 1960s was a big part of it. They took the word and stripped it of its negative connotations. For them, dude became a relaxed, informal greeting. It lost its association with fancy clothes and became a sign of belonging to a laid-back, anti-establishment group. From there, it spread through movies and television into the mainstream, but the ghost of the medieval dudeman is still there. The scarecrow was a generic human shape. It wasn't a specific person, it was just a man figure. The modern dude has that same generic quality. When you say, hey dude, you're not referring to any specific quality of the person, you're just using a generic placeholder for person. From a scarecrow in a 15th century field to a surfer on a 20th century beach, the word has traveled a long and winding road. It started as a word for empty clothes and became a word for a person, but it never quite lost that sense of being a simple generic human shape. Number 3, going wook in a monastery. The modern term woke refers to being alert to social injustice, particularly racism. It implies a kind of awakening to a hidden reality of power and oppression. The word itself is new, but the concept of a sudden, profound awakening to a deeper truth is a very old idea. And we can find a powerful parallel in the spiritual lives of medieval monks and mystics. For them, the awakening was not to social justice, but to the presence of God. But the structure of the experience, the sense of having been asleep and now being awake, is strikingly similar. Consider the case of Richard Rolle. He was an English hermit and writer who lived in the first half of the 14th century. He was born around 1300 and died in 1349. As a young man, he studied at Oxford, but he found it spiritually empty. He felt that the intellectual debates and careerism of the university were a distraction from the real business of life knowing and loving God. So, at the age of 19, he had a profound spiritual crisis. He felt he was wasting his life. He decided to drop out of society and become a hermit. Rolle described his spiritual journey in his writings, particularly in a book called The Fire of Love. He talks about his life before his conversion as a state of sleep or darkness. He was going through the motions, living according to the world's standards, but his soul was asleep. His awakening was a deliberate choice. He describes making a costume for himself out of an old hood and a couple of his sister's tunics to look like a hermit. He then ran away from home and began a life of intense prayer and solitude. His goal was to achieve a direct, personal experience of God. This was a radical idea at the time. The conventional path to God was through the church, through its sacraments and its hierarchy. Rolle was seeking an unmediated connection. He spent years in deep contemplation, and he describes the process as a gradual awakening. He writes about moving from a state of coldness and darkness to one of calor, canor, dulcor, heat, song, and sweetness. He felt a literal, physical heat in his chest, which he interpreted as the fire of the Holy Spirit. He heard a heavenly music. He felt a profound spiritual sweetness. This experience for Rolle was like waking up from a dream. The world he had lived in before, the world of Oxford debates and social status, now seemed like a shadow. He had woken up to the only thing that was truly real, the love of God. He wrote, "I have been set in a state of awakening." He saw other people, those still caught up in worldly affairs, as being spiritually asleep. His mission, as he saw it, was to write about his experience and try to wake them up too. His writings were incredibly popular. They were copied and circulated widely in England for the next 200 years. He wrote in a passionate personal style that was very different from the dry academic Latin of the theologians. He was speaking from direct experience, and people responded to that authenticity. He was telling them that they too could wake up. They didn't need to be a bishop or a great scholar. They just needed to turn their hearts to God. The parallel to the modern concept of woke is in this structure of awakening. Both ideas posit that most people are living in a state of illusion, a kind of sleep. For Rolle, the illusion was the belief that worldly things like wealth and power are important. For modern woke culture, the illusion is the belief that society is fair and just, ignoring the systemic inequalities that lie beneath the surface. In both cases, the awakened person feels they have access to a deeper, more important truth. They see the world differently than the sleeping masses. And like the modern term Rolle state of awakening also brought him into conflict with the establishment. The church hierarchy was suspicious of mystics like Rolle. His claim to a direct, personal connection with God seemed to bypass their authority. If anyone could just wake up and experience God on their own, what was the point of the church? Rolle was never declared a heretic, but he was a controversial figure. His wokeness was a challenge to the established order. He was telling people that the system they lived in was based on false values. He was calling for a radical personal transformation that had profound social and political implications. His spiritual awakening was not just a private feeling, it was a critique of the world. Number 2, ghosting a suitor in 1477. Ghosting is a modern term for ending a relationship by simply disappearing, no explanation, no final conversation, just silence. It feels like a product of our impersonal digital age. But the act of ghosting, the painful, confusing experience of being abandoned without a word, is much older than the internet. We can see a clear case of it in the 15th century letters of the Paston family. The story revolves around Marjorie Bruce, a young woman from a respectable Norfolk family. In 1477, she was in the middle of the complicated process of finding a husband. Her family was in negotiations with the Paston family for her to marry John Paston III. The two had met and seemed to genuinely like each other, but marriage in the 15th century was a business transaction. The biggest sticking point was the dowry. Marjorie's father was offering a certain amount of land and money, and the Pastons were holding out for more. The negotiations dragged on. John and Marjorie were clearly falling in love. Marjorie wrote a series of famous letters to John during this period, addressing him as her right well-beloved Valentine. They are some of the most charming and heartfelt documents from the entire Middle Ages. She told him that even if he had no money at all, she would still love him, but she begged him to try to win her father over because she did not want to forsake her family. But John Paston was not Marjorie's only suitor. Before the negotiations with the Pastons had become serious, another man was in the picture. His name was Stephen Scrope. He was a much older man, a veteran of the wars in France, and he was John Fastolf's stepson, which made him a very powerful connection. On paper, he was a great match, but he was also known to be difficult, and he had a reputation for being sickly. The Bruce family had likely been in communication with Scrope about a potential marriage to Marjorie. We don't have Scrope's letters, but we can reconstruct the situation from the Paston correspondence. At some point, as the talks with the more desirable, younger, and healthier John Paston progressed, the Bruce family simply stopped responding to Stephen Scrope. They ghosted him. We can imagine the situation from Scrope's perspective. He was a proud, powerful man. He had made an offer of marriage. He would have sent messengers, letters, and inquiries, and in return he would have received. Not Marjorie was not at home. The polite fictions would have been maintained for a while, but eventually the silence would have become deafening. There would be no formal letter saying, "Thank you for your interest, but we have decided to go in another direction." There was just an absence. This was a calculated social strategy. To formally reject a man like Stephen Scrope would have been a direct insult. It could have created a powerful enemy. Scrope was well connected. He could have made life very difficult for the Bruce family, who were of a lower social standing. So instead of a direct confrontation, they chose the path of passive avoidance. They let the proposal die of neglect. They hoped that Scrope would eventually take the hint and move on. For Marjorie, this was probably a relief. She was in love with John Paston, but for Scrope, it must have been a frustrating and humiliating experience. He was left in limbo, unsure of his status, his proposal neither accepted nor rejected. He was being treated as an irrelevance. The silence was the message. It said, "You are no longer a consideration. This is the core of ghosting, then and now." It's a way of avoiding an uncomfortable conversation. It prioritizes the comfort of the ghoster over the feelings of the ghosted. It turns a person into a non-person. The Bruce family wasn't thinking about Stephen Scrope's feelings. They were thinking about their own social and economic advantage. Like, ghosting him was the path of least resistance. In the end, it worked. Scrope eventually moved on. Marjorie and John did get married, and their love story became a small bright spot in the often brutal history of the Paston family. But their happiness was built on a foundation that included a classic case of 15th century ghosting. The technology has changed, but the awkward, painful business of human relationships and the cowardly ways we sometimes choose to end them have remained remarkably consistent. Number one, the first recorded flex was a Viking boast. Before there was flexing, there was boasting, and few cultures in history have perfected the art of the boast like the Vikings. For the Norse warriors and poets of the early Middle Ages, the boast, or gilp in Old English, was not just arrogant bragging. It was a formal public declaration of intent. It was a promise of future deeds made in front of your peers that you were honor-bound to fulfill. It was a contract with your own reputation. The classic setting for the boast was the mead hall. Imagine a chieftain, maybe a man named Bjorn, in his longhouse in Denmark around the year 850. The fire is roaring in the central hearth. The hall is filled with his warriors, his herd. They have been feasting and drinking. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke and roasted meat. At a certain point in the evening, the chieftain would call for silence. This was the time for formal speeches for the sumbel, a ritual of toasting and boasting. A warrior would stand up, raise his drinking horn, and make a toast to the gods or to an ancestor. Then he would make his boast. He would not say, "I'm a pretty good fighter." He would be specific. He might say, "Before this winter is over, I will sail to the coast of Anglia and be the first man to leap from my longship onto the shore. I will bring back the silver from the church at Lindisfarne, or I will die on that beach." This was a flex of the highest order. It was a public performance of courage and ambition. The rest of the hall would listen intently. This was not idle talk. This was a warrior staking his honor, his very identity on his words. If he succeeded, his fame would grow. Songs would be sung about him. His name would live on after his death. If he failed, or worse, if he didn't even try, he would be shamed. He would be a knighting, a man without honor, the worst thing a Viking could be. The boast was a high-stakes social and personal commitment. You know, we see this culture of boasting recorded in the epic poems of the era. The most famous example is in Beowulf, an Old English poem that tells the story of Scandinavian heroes. The poem was written down around the year 1000, but it describes a much older world. When the hero Beowulf arrives in Denmark to fight the monster Grendel, he goes to the mead hall of King Hrothgar. Before he does anything, he introduces himself with a magnificent boast. He doesn't just say he's strong. He gives a detailed resume of his past, flexes. He says, "I have grappled with 5 giants and drove that race from the earth. I have swam in the blackest of nights, killing sea monsters." And he is establishing his credentials. Then he makes his boast for the future. He declares that he will fight Grendel with his bare hands, without a sword or a shield. "I will match my strength against the fiends," he says. This is an incredible flex. He is not just promising to win, he is promising to win in the most difficult and honorable way possible. The entire hall, which had been in a state of terror and despair, is electrified by his confidence. The boast had a flip side. You could also boast about the achievements of your ancestors or the quality of your weapons. In Beowulf, another character, Unferth, tries to challenge Beowulf by bringing up a story of a swimming contest he supposedly lost. This is a kind of anti-boast, an attempt to publicly diminish another's reputation. Beowulf masterfully turns it around, telling his own version of the story, where he not only won, but also killed 9 sea monsters along the way. He flexes back harder. This was a world where your reputation was everything. There were no courts to enforce contracts in the same way we have now. A man's word was his bond, and the boast was the most public and solemn form of giving your word. It was a way of creating your own destiny. By speaking it aloud, you made it real. You forced yourself to live up to your own hype. The modern flex is often about showing off what you already have: a new car, an expensive watch. The Viking guilt was about showing off what you were going to do. It was a flex of future potential, backed by the currency of honor. It was a promise to the world and to yourself that you were a person of consequence.